All of us need God's presence. We cannot do without God's presence. For every day there are challenges. Every day there are choices to be made, decisions to be taken, and without God's presence, it becomes very difficult. There's a beautiful promise in Exodus 33 verse 14 where God assures Moses of his presence. He says, "My presence will go with you and I will give you rest." What a beautiful promise. How did Moses get this promise? It's quite interesting because in the beginning of the chapter we find God tells Moses that his presence will not go with them to the promised land. In fact, in chapter 32 we find God is angry and he's ready to destroy his people. But we find Moses standing in the gap, interceding, pleading with God. And when God says that he will send an angel, but he will not go with them, he says, "God, we need your presence. If your presence doesn't go with us, do not send us up from here." Moses' desperate desire for God's presence. His heart longed for God's presence. Moses' heart not only longed for God's presence, he also practiced God's presence. Same chapter 33, 7 following, we find Moses used to pitch a tent outside the camp and go to the tent of meeting and spend time with God. It's beautifully described over here. When he would go to the tent of meeting, the presence of God would just come down and be there. And at the entrance, the pillar of cloud would be there as long as Moses would talk to God, have a communion with God. What a beautiful description. God's presence was a reality in Moses' life. Moses not only practiced God's presence, he also carried God's presence. It says when he would go to the tent, people on either side over there, they would stand outside the tent. And Moses would go, they would watch him go to the tent. And as he entered, till he entered, they would watch him because Moses carried the presence and anointing of God. God's presence was a reality in Moses' life. My prayer is this. We as Christ followers, may we have a deep longing for God's presence like Moses. May we practice God's presence daily, worshiping Him, reading the Bible, having a communion with Him, and carry God's presence, the fragrance of Jesus, to our hurting world and bring hope, healing, and restoration to our broken world and make a difference wherever we go. God bless you.